Du lytter til Radio Krishna på 87,6 MHz, en dybere dimension i radio. I denne afdeling af Radio Krishna skal vi høre en forelæsning med vores videnskabsmand fra Amerika, Sarabutta Das. Den her optagelse den stammer fra Radharades-templet i Belgien, og her taler han specifikt om forholdet mellem Gud og moderne videnskab. Og det gør han hovedsageligt her fra et historisk perspektiv, men han kommer også ind på mange andre aspekter af dette interessante emne, plus at han svarer på spørgsmål fra publikum i anden halvdel af denne forelæsning. Det er en lidt længere sag, så spids ørerne, koncentrer jer og lyt med her til et meget interessant foredrag. Din studievært og tekniker hedder Yadunandan Das. Og vi siger værsgo til Sarabutta, som altså taler på engelsk.
But the Big Bang was a different kind of explosion. Because in Einstein's theory, as you go back, the contraction going backwards in time proceeds right down to a point. Mathematically, this is what happens in Einstein's scheme. Relation between God and the laws of physics. This is an important topic. Historically, with the development of Western science, a conflict arose between science and religion, which was based ultimately on the idea that nature is functioning according to certain physical laws. Just to give some background, the idea in the Middle Ages, say in Europe, was that nature is under the control of the will of God. Everything is moving by divine providence. This was the medieval Christian idea. And it is the basic idea that you find in all theistic forms of religion, that there's a supreme transcendental intelligent being who is directly controlling the different phenomena of nature. This idea is very fundamental. And it's directly related to various forms of religious understanding. The very idea of spiritual experience requires that God must have some direct control over the transformations of matter. Because suppose, for example, that a human being has some experience of God and then tells somebody else about it. Well, by telling somebody else about it, matter is moving in a way which corresponds to that experience. When the person speaks about his experience or writes about it in a book, such as, for example, Chaitanya Charitamrita, then matter is being moved in such a way as to correspond to that experience. Therefore, you have to have some link between the way matter is moving and the transcendental reality being described. Also, if someone prays to God, and God answers that prayer in some way, then that means that God must be directly controlling the motion of matter in some fashion. So, in order to have religion in its traditional form, that is, a theistic type of religion, of course there are religions that posit an impersonal absolute which does not interact in any way with nature, and that's a different situation. But in all those religions that posit a personal, supreme controller, it is necessary to suppose that this supreme transcendental person is controlling matter, causing matter to move according to divine will. Of course, obviously, that's the position that Krishna presents in the Bhagavad Gita. With the development of modern science, people became convinced of a set of ideas that contradicts this basic conception that God is controlling matter. So what developed was the idea that matter moves according to mechanical laws. The sort of paradigm for this is the idea of a clock. From the 12th to the 13th century in Europe, clocks became very popular. People began to build very elaborate clocks that they would put in church towers and so forth. And the conception of the universe as an elaborate clock developed. So if you look at a clock, you'll see that you have a mechanism with gears that mesh with one another and so forth, in which everything moves by cause and effect in a deterministic way. The state of the clock at one point in time is determined by the state of the clock at a slightly earlier point in time. So, in order to know what the clock is doing, you just have to know the rules by which it is functioning and the initial state at some particular time. And with that information, you can determine exactly what the clock is going to do from that point onward. And there's no question of intervention from any outside force. Of course, obviously, someone can go up to a clock and move the gears, but that's an interference in the normal functioning of the clock. If someone does that, you say, well, the clock has been interfered with, and it's now malfunctioning. It's not functioning correctly. So the idea was developed that the universe is essentially an elaborate clock. The universe is made up of matter. Matter is composed of some kind of minute atomic constituents. These interact with one another according to laws that can be defined in mathematical terms, and the interactions are deterministic, so that whatever is happening in the universe now is completely determined by what was happening just a moment before, and that's determined by what was happening a moment before that, and so forth. So this is the idea of the clockwork universe. So this kind of idea became prominent in Europe in the time of Descartes and Newton. Of course, Newton made a very strong contribution to this idea. The idea had already been current long before his time. But with the development of Newtonian physics, scientists became convinced that the universe actually is running in a deterministic fashion. So then the question is, if this is so, what role does God have to play in the unfolding of events within the universe? It would seem that if everything is unfolding in a deterministic fashion, then there is no possibility for God to play any role in that, unless God comes and actually violates the laws of nature. So this is the idea that developed. Now, Newton himself thought that God violated the laws of nature from time to time. He explicitly proposed this. In fact, he suggested that the orbits of the planets would not be perfectly regular if the planets simply followed Newton's laws of motion. He suggested that the planets would drift out of their proper orbits gradually, and that God would occasionally intervene and set them into their orbits again. So this was Newton's idea. So there was a philosopher living at the time called Leibniz, who disagreed with Newton about this. Actually, Newton and Leibniz had a long-standing conflict. For example, they had a big battle over who invented calculus. But anyway, Leibniz claimed that Newton was saying that God was like a bad clockmaker, a poor artisan who would make a clock which didn't keep time properly, so he'd have to keep coming and adjusting it. And Leibniz proposed that actually God was a perfect clockmaker, and that he made the universe in such a way that it did not need any further interference or adjustment after the initial creation. So according to this idea, in the beginning of time, at the time of the creation, God constructed the universe and constructed the natural laws which govern the motion of the atoms and so forth, and let the whole thing run and didn't intervene with it at all in it at all from that time onward. So this more or less became the prevailing idea in the scientific community from that time onward, and that has been true pretty much down to the present day. So this, in effect, eliminates religion. If by religion you mean the development of a personal relationship between an individual human being and God, the reason that religion is ruled out by this, as I was indicating before, is that if the human being develops some kind of relationship with God, then the behavior of that human being must change in a way that has something to do directly with God. And since the human body is made of matter, that means matter must be moved by God in some way. That's required then if you're going to have religion. So this idea then, which we could call the mechanistic picture of the universe, rules out religion. So initially, it was perhaps not clearly apparent to many people that this was the real consequence of the development of these ideas. Gradually, this became more apparent. Of course, initially, people still thought that you had to have God in order to account for the high degree of order and organization that you find within the universe. The idea was that the different forms of life and so forth had to be created in the beginning of time by some supreme intelligence. Otherwise, you couldn't account for the existence of this very high level of organization. However, at about the middle of the 19th century, Charles Darwin provided a theory which would explain how order could arise, at least in living systems, without any need to posit some creative intelligence. So he came up with his theory of evolution. Of course, Darwin did not create the idea of organic evolution. Darwin's own grandfather had in fact written a book in which he proposed a theory of evolution. But Darwin's real contribution was that he proposed a mechanistic theory of evolution. That is, he proposed a way in which living organisms could evolve in a step-by-step fashion entirely by the action of mechanistic laws, without the intervention of any kind of transcendental intelligence, or without invoking any kind of mystical agency of any sort. So that was Darwin's real contribution. And that essentially filled out the mechanistic picture that the physicists had already elaborated, because it eliminated the need to introduce this supernatural being into the universe in any way at all. So from that point onward, over the latter part of the 19th century, the idea gradually became firmly established in the scientific community that God has no role at all to play in the universe as an active agency. So the further history then of these ideas is that many Christian denominations or sects have basically adopted this viewpoint. Most of the common people who follow these different Christian churches are perhaps not fully aware of this, because it completely eliminates the basis for their religious observances. However, the more sophisticated theologians have adopted these views. I'll just give you an example of one such theologian. In England, there's a man named John Polkinghorne, who was a physicist at Cambridge University for many years, and who retired from physics to become an Anglican priest. And so you might ask, well, how does he reconcile his ideas about physics with the requirements of the Christian theology? So he's explained this in some detail. And basically, his proposal is that God's role in the universe is to sustain the laws of nature. His idea is that matter and the laws, the physical laws which govern the behavior of matter, are being sustained at every moment by God.